morning. I can start with sharing screen here to ground us since our recording is going already. Good to see everybody. Thank you for joining. We're going to jump right in to make sure we get through the presentation and allow time for question and answer as well. Good morning and welcome. Today's presentation is on equitable climate adaptation, and it's a part of the series that we're bringing forward to the Coastal Climate Resilience Collaborative Group to support knowledge sharing and ideation for the regional climate resilience that we are progressing together. I'm calling in from the village of Chekwelp, from the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish Nation. The nature spirit here is shining through with vibrant colors as the season transitions, and I'm surrounded by cedar and fir trees that provide me shade and cooling in the hot summer months and remind me to root into the soil as I reach for the sun. This is actually an image from just adjacent to where I'm calling in from. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, share your name and affiliation and where you're calling in from. We're glad you could join us. I want to acknowledge that the project that we're coming together through is funded by Natural Resources Canada's Climate Resilient Coastal Communities Program. And the project is a regional collaborative in the south coast of BC.
Just look at financial perspective.
We'll just do a mute here. And yeah, so the project spans the unceded ancestral territories of Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Sechelt nations. And ICLEI Canada is facilitating the regional collaborative to engage with staff from nations and local governments and regional districts to bring them together to progress collaboration on implementation of climate resiliency together. So where we're at kind of in the project timeline is in phase 3, and one of the activities in phase 3 is to do training activities to support our ideation and progression of implementation. So this session today is one of those training offerings. And the session today will provide a foundation for developing equitable climate resilience solutions, and it will include real-world examples to support and inspire your work. I am going to stop screen share now and introduce our presenters. Maybe I will pin them as I say hello. We have Niloofar Mohtat and Naomi Wolfe joining us as our colleagues and experts from ICLEI Canada. They work closely with me and have come in and out on this project. Naomi is a climate change project coordinator at ICLEI Canada. She supports projects that advance social and community resilience through initiatives like the Ontario Resource Centre for Climate Adaptation. She also supports the development of tools and resources, particularly those focused on inclusive adaptation for local governments and nations. Naomi is a passionate storyteller and community builder who sees relationships as the starting point for change. She believes that through listening and sharing our stories, we develop equitable social structures that are needed for thriving, resilient communities. And previously, Naomi was the storytelling and engagement lead with the Canada Healthy Communities initiatives. She worked with over 1,000 projects, partners and organizations and community leaders to develop a network of placemakers and community builders committed to enhancing the public space landscape. We have also with us Niloofar Mohtat. She's a climate change project coordinator at ICLEI Canada and works directly with the project that the regional collaborative that we're leading. And within ICLEI Canada, Niloofar supports a range of climate adaptation initiatives, including the BARC program and the Coastal Resilience Collaborative, which I mentioned. She brings experience at the intersection of climate adaptation, urban planning, and equity. And prior to ICLEI, she led research on housing, affordability, equity, and climate resilience through the Climate and Equity Lab at York University. She holds a PhD in planning and has contributed to research on equity-driven adaptation policies and green infrastructure planning. Her background also includes spatial analysis of climate risks, including federal work on wildfire and flood mapping. Really delighted to have you both here with us. I will pass it over to our presenters. And I will just ask that if you have any questions come up during the presentations, feel free to type them in the chat. And we will also have a question answer period at the end that you'll get a chance to speak to your questions if you wish. Over to you, Naomi.
Amazing. Hello, everyone. Lovely to meet you all. I'm just going to get my screen going. Okay. And there we go. Can everyone see everything okay? Okay, great. So yeah, lovely to meet you all. Thank you so much for having me today to present. So before getting started, I will just offer a land acknowledgement from where I'm calling in from. So I'm calling in today from Toronto to Toronto, which is located on the traditional territory of many nations. Of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. The city is also covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Now, I want to ground today's session in the importance of relationships and relationship building. Also acknowledging that as someone who has lived here my whole life, my own ability to live, work, and play on this land must go hand in hand with shifting my own relationship to this place, its history, and the people who live and have lived and who continue to steward this land by learning, reflecting, meaningfully engaging, and taking action. Similarly, incorporating equity into the work that we do as climate practitioners cannot take place without intentional, respectful, and reciprocal relationship building that's based on listening, learning, and building a foundation for trust. So thank you again for having me. Today's presentation, I'm going to take you through a resource that can help to support with embedding equity into the adaptation work that you do. Before jumping into that resource, I will also take some time to ground the presentation in why this matters before moving into a more detailed look at the resource, key concepts and tools that you can use in your own work with a focus on engagement. So jump right in. Okay, so some of you may have seen this phrase before, or something similar, noting that the impacts of climate change will not be experienced in the same way by all people. So similarly, the way in which we plan and respond to climate impacts also cannot be uniform. This is where the conversation on equity and adaptation comes in. I always like to share, I remember, with a project I was working on about a year ago, talking with one of the partners and we had a conversation on the fact that equity is and must be an inherent part of the work that we do on adaptation to ensure that it's meaningful and that it is adaptation for all. And so sort of, again, to kind of ground the conversation as we move forward. So, a refresher on what equity means, or for those of you who maybe haven't sort of seen the definition before, equity refers to fairness and justice. Whereas equality means providing the same to all, equity means recognizing that we do not all start from the same place and must acknowledge and make adjustments to these imbalances. The process is ongoing, requiring us to identify and overcome intentional and unintentional barriers arising from bias or systemic structures. So that definition from the National Association of Colleges and Employers. Now, when we think about equitable frameworks, when it comes to adaptation, it's really about moving away from this idea of one-size-fits-all solutions. Now, equitable frameworks recognize that different communities and individuals come to the adaptation conversation with distinct experiences in relation to climate change that are informed by different social conditions and systems of power that shape how these impacts are felt. Now, in the next two slides, I'm going to kind of give a visual representation of what this means. But before jumping in, kind of wanted to note that, these differentiated experiences, in the context of adaptation work are often referred to as vulnerabilities. It is important to recognize that this term is one that is, controversial or sort of ongoing discussion around where it fits, because it really cannot adequately capture the way that systemic inequities and systems of power shape social and community context, health and healthcare, economic stability, the natural and physical environment, et cetera. It also fails to acknowledge the agency, expertise, and skills that many who are labeled as vulnerable possess. And it has been used historically to refer to communities in a way that often removes community agency or seeks to, and erases the systems of power and privilege that have shaped these determinants. So in many ways, it removes accountability. And so, conversations are, ongoing around how to best refer to the ways in which certain individuals and communities face greater risk of experiencing climate impacts as a result of systemic injustice. And it is essential that climate adaptation consider these differentiated experiences. It is also important to keep in mind how this term is used, ensuring that it's not used to label communities or individuals or to define them as such, in whatever way you're approaching this work. So back to this sort of distinction between equity and equality can sometimes be a helpful set of concepts to understand sort of visually. So this graphic and the next one are both from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they offer a good visual example of the difference, especially when designing solutions. So, on the left, you can see sort of the red background, a solution that offers the same thing to everyone doesn't actually serve the needs of different individuals. However, on the right, designing solutions that respond to specific needs of individuals make for effective and meaningful solutions. So, the second slide I really like. So similar to the previous slide, the visual on the right, the blue background represents an equity-focused solution that serves the needs of different individuals. And I really like this graphic because crosswalks and pedestrian pathways can often be an example of how adaptation and equity intersect, especially when it comes to planning. So, if we wanted to take this graphic on the right a step further, we can also ask, what does snow removal look like at this crosswalk? Even the one that's been designed to be more equitable. A crosswalk can be designed in an equitable way, but if access hasn't been considered year-round, so moving beyond just the design, but also thinking about, planning and ongoing maintenance, snow removal can be something that, might push snow into the middle of the pedestrian pathway, or it might not be prioritized for snow removal. And then even the most equitable, sort of equitably designed crosswalk, might be rendered inaccessible to many. So it's important to kind of think about these two elements or sort of multiple elements in the conversation on adaptation and planning and implementation, that it's not just in designing sort of hard pieces of infrastructure, but also thinking about what that looks like beyond, and considering that in planning for maintenance, other forms of work. So again, as noted, we're going to dive into a resource that can help to support your collaborative adaptation work. But before doing so, I just wanted to touch on this concept of maladaptation to further emphasize why equitable approaches to climate adaptation are so essential. So maladaptation refers to when actions intended to reduce vulnerability to climate change inadvertently increase it, either for the people undertaking the action or for others now or in the future. It might be helpful to think of these maladaptations as unintended consequences. So Indigenous Climate Hub notes that according to the 2022 IPCC assessment report, adaptation planning and implementation that do not consider adverse outcomes for different groups can lead to maladaptation, increasing exposure to risks, marginalizing people from certain socioeconomic or livelihood groups, and exacerbating inequity. So to think about this maybe in the context of coastal adaptation, certain coastal flood control measures, such as the implementation of seawalls, often redirect the hazards of increased swell and storm surges to neighboring regions. These kind of adaptation measures, while solving a challenge in one location, may simply displace and amplify those threats to elsewhere. When you think about the kinds of resources that may be required to implement this kind of infrastructure, it may mean that a community or a neighborhood or an area that has higher number of resources to implement this kind of solution may displace those impacts to a region, municipality, community, neighborhood that has limited access to those same resources. Additionally, this kind of project might increase erosion elsewhere or lead to habitat loss or ecological disruption. And this also has ripple effects, related to accessing local food sources for certain communities. Another more general example could be looking at the displacement of certain communities to implement green infrastructure or major transit projects. Not only do these often happen in areas where residents may not be prioritized in consultation or where, conditions like, consultation that occurs within a 9 to 5 sort of structure or, kind of factors sort of aren't prioritized for that community, thinking about, different needs. For showing up to those kinds of consultations, but also the impacts of this kind of displacement on renters versus property owners might also look quite different. So taking an equity-focused approach that centers engagement, collaboration, and community design solutions is important for ensuring that there are not unintended consequences of adaptation efforts that compound pre-existing inequities or create new ones. Okay, so having kind of emphasized the importance of applying an equity approach to adaptation work, I'm going to walk you through this tool that can help, resource that can help to support with embedding this lens into your efforts, highlight some of its contents while discussing key concepts, and then Niloofar will take some time to go through examples and discuss in more detail how equitable and inclusive engagement informs adaptation work. So Equitable Climate Adaptation Considerations for Local Governments is a resource that can help to guide you through equitable engagement processes for adaptation. And while it focuses quite a bit on engagement, it also gives some insight into understanding and addressing primary barriers to centering equity. It offers replicable case studies of local action and highlights a number of tangible and applicable tools for centering equity in your adaptation efforts moving forward. Now, before moving on to the next slide, I do want to recognize and sort of emphasize that, this is a tool that needs to be one of many, that embedding equity also can't be done through a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So different communities may have different, move at different speeds, have distinct protocols for engagement and for moving forward in decision-making processes. So, that's an important piece to factor into when thinking about how to actually implement the tools and resources through this guide. So really it is a starting point for how to engage with adaptation in a more equitable way. But this work must also go hand in hand with meaningful relationship building, listening, and trust building that will further help to inform the work that you do. So one of the things that this guide sort of emphasizes is looking at historical ways in which engagement has been undertaken through sort of the decision-making level. So often these processes, led by municipalities or local governments or other community institutions or supported by various professional sectors, have long denied the rights, needs, and experiences of equity-deserving and denied groups. So these are many of the processes through which an increased risk of climate impacts has been compounded. So this might look like pushing racialized communities into higher risk geographic locations through processes of urban renewal, cutting accessible and affordable transit services, making decisions for communities instead of with communities. Engagement with the public, especially equity denied and deserving groups, has largely been meant to placate rather than listen and respond to the needs of communities. It's really starting from a lack of meaningful engagement. So this might look like engaging with different communities, but not incorporating what is heard into the actual work being done, or being accountable to those you have engaged. These types of processes can lead to an erosion of trust in local governments, which then impacts the ability to meaningfully engage moving forward. So decision makers, organizations leading in these planning processes really need to engage in processes of trust building, harm reduction, and restorative justice. But also this requires recognizing the historical relationship of how harm has been inflicted in the first place. So learning is an important step to inclusive and equitable adaptation. And there are questions that must be asked in order to start building relationships, rebuilding relationships, engaging meaningfully, and being able to put the lessons learned into practice. And it's really important to start to make that shift in a relationship, from sort of the level of, again, decision-making, planning, institutions, to communities and individuals that have been historically marginalized. So making the shift can start with a few key actions. So recognizing power dynamics between decision-making actors and community members. So this can look like asking and reflecting on where power needs to be given back or shared when it comes to local decision-making. This also requires knowledge of the existing power dynamics. And can also start with actions like internal trainings, workshops, and knowledge building to get grounded in important concepts, challenging patterns of behavior that perpetuate inequities and uneven patterns of participation in decision making. So one of the things I like to emphasize here is that fear of doing things wrong can often be a barrier to taking action. And at the same time, learning about privilege and past and ongoing harms can be an uncomfortable process. But reflecting on whether or not this discomfort is stopping you from making change is also an important part of moving forward in an inclusive and equitable way. As well as considering how to build accountability into the processes that you undertake. The third point I'll note is sort of acknowledging and working with communities and marginalized members as active agents of change. So communities don't need to be empowered, right? They already have the tools and knowledge to make change and often are doing that. Often the ways also that privilege is recognized or approached erases tools and assets such as intimate social networks that exist in a lot of equity deserving and denied communities. So asking questions like, how does your work recognize the expertise of each person who comes to the table is an important question to ask. And what does leadership look like within different communities, and how are you building partnerships and relationships that recognize that leadership? Part of incorporating equity into adaptation means moving from a top-down approach to one that centers the voices of equity denied and deserving communities. So just kind of focus briefly on some of the tools that can sort of start to help guide you that are in this resource. But so it can be helpful to identify what the equity objectives of your work are, especially when engaging with new projects. So the breakdown that I've shown here comes from the USDN Guide to Equitable Community-Driven Climate Preparedness. And it recognizes 3 types of objectives based in the pillars of equity. So procedural objectives, so these are often process-oriented. They emphasize equitable treatment and include engagement as a part of the processes that you undertake. Distributional, so that focuses on resources, benefits, and burdens, and the equitable distribution and redistribution of resources, benefits, and then structural, which is really systems oriented and aims to address the root causes of inequity. It is about maximizing benefits and minimizing unintended consequences, and emphasizes community leadership and decision-making as a key component. And so projects can incorporate all 3 of these objectives, especially if your organization has already embedded them into the work it does in some sort of way. And at the same time, it's important to recognize that even if your organization isn't yet driving that change, you don't have to wait. A key goal of all of this is to disrupt systems of power and privilege beyond a single project. But a single project can also start to move the needle on making that major change. And so I want to offer that reflection. So again, talking about some of the tools that are available in the resource that can be applied to the work that you're doing. So this here, the Wheel of Power and Privilege is a useful resource and starting point for recognizing the different ways that people exist in proximity to power. So this proximity can influence how different voices are privileged in decision-making, access to resources, how systems are designed for the perceived majority, that serve or don't serve them, and more. So it can really help to reflect on how you and the individuals and communities that you work within and are a part of exist in relation to different but often intersecting power structures. In some cases, these relationships may shift at different times and in different contexts. They also intersect with each other to inform lived experience in different ways. And so, maybe something you've heard is this connects to the idea of intersectionality, which is a concept that was coined by a lawyer, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989, and refers to the idea that systems of power do not operate in isolation, especially in how they're brought to bear on the lives of individuals. So when it comes to adaptation work, this wheel can be used when considering the impacts of climate change to better reflect on how inequity will compound these impacts and put certain groups at greater risk. Building off of this knowledge, it can also be used to inform project planning and implementation to better understand how your project, activity, or initiative will benefit or who might be excluded, who might face barriers to accessing the benefits, or who might face unintended consequences as a result. One thing I do like to note about this is an American resource, so it may not perfectly apply to the Canadian or this sort of context. Keeping that in mind, it's also not a complete or conclusive list, nor does it make distinctions between how these relationships play out in different ways or to different degrees. But again, regardless, it's a great starting point for reflecting on power differentials and relationships of power as you move forward in your work. 2 more slides for me, and then I'll pass it over to Niloofar. This one's pretty brief, but another tool that's featured in the resource is sort of some guidance on building the case around embedding equity into the work that you do. So it can really be used to support you in making the case for investing in and pursuing climate adaptation policy changes, programs, and infrastructure development that prioritizes equity. Ideally, one doesn't have to make that case, but in reality, sometimes there is an element of having to build that connection for folks to get the kind of investment needed to carry this work forward. And so the tool summarizes how a range of different social issues, which decision makers, local governments, communities may interact with, are connected to and impacted by climate change, to help you develop effective messages for your audience. So this can also help you to form your own case for action, make connections with audience priorities, kind of hit the messaging home. Especially when coming up against pushback or in situations where equity isn't necessarily prioritized at the organizational level. It can help to break down some of these barriers and really emphasizes the interconnection between meaningful adaptation and equity. So the last slide for me is that is a pretty meaty part of the resource that I'll sort of go over with you before I pass it to Niloofar, but I do recommend digging into it, sort of jumping into it and seeing what you can gain, learn, reflect on. And it's a super helpful resource that offers a number of different questions that you can actually ask across project phases to help consider equity and how equitable engagement should and can be undertaken to help with project design, initiation, delivery, and follow-up. So it focuses on 3 types of projects: infrastructure, plans and policies, and programming for climate adaptation. Although I will say that these questions can be adapted and applied to lots of different other contexts. They emphasize reflection, trust building, accountability, and meaningful engagement. So, you can see there's questions about before project initiation, project delivery, such as, before engaging, have you assessed whether the project and associated engagement have the potential to benefit equity deserving communities? In the project initiation phase, have you developed staff, community, and political readiness with an understanding of why the project must center equity and climate adaptation? And then in project delivery, are you using methods to lower barriers to engagement? So, that can be a really important question to be asking. Often engagements take place, in timeframes, again, that don't really allow for people whose jobs maybe don't fall within the classic 9-to-5 structure to be able to attend, or, at times where, if someone is a single parent, times where they might be able to work around, key points where they have to be at home versus, being engaged in other ways. Could also come, to a question of virtual engagement versus in-person engagement. So a number of different questions related to that. And then, are you regularly reporting back to the communities you have engaged with? So that's really about that accountability piece. So in some ways, it's not dissimilar to an equity lens, which is an approach that is increasingly being developed by communities to support adaptation planning and implementation. And what I really like about the resource is that it prompts the user to recognize limits and aspects of relationship building that recognize where there's broken trust. Again, it leans into engagement as a key component of designing solutions that can actually meet the needs of different communities and individuals. And as noted, engagement is just one part of the process and can be more or less meaningful depending on the approach and care that's taken. It's important to move beyond engagement for engagement's sake and to prioritize and ensure that community voices are incorporated into the work being undertaken. And then with and through the relationships formed in engagement processes, you can design more effective adaptation solutions and move toward approaches that actually center community-led decision-making. So, as noted earlier, incorporating equity into adaptation efforts isn't just a one-time thing. You do to check off a checklist. It needs to be an ongoing intentional process and one that requires constant reflection and reevaluation and accountability alongside meaningful efforts to build trust and center equity denied and deserving groups as key decision makers. It means recognizing where power is held and reflecting on and taking action to shift that power balance. And so while this work can sometimes be uncomfortable or require openness to discomfort, it's essential for shaping a path forward for adaptation that is truly meaningful and designed for all, and that can minimize harm and maximize benefits. So thanks. On that note, I will pass it over to Niloofar.
Thank you, Naomi. So I'm going to just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's good. Presenter view, thanks.
Thank you.
Perfect.
And okay. So, oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Naomi, and hello, everybody. Here, I'm just trying to bring you some examples to just investigate how equity can be connected to climate change adaptation measures that are done by municipalities, local governments, or regional governments. And this section actually also includes a couple of questions that you can consider when you're developing projects that connect equity with climate adaptation. The first example of this project ideas relates to green infrastructure and public spaces. Research by Nature Canada shows that neighborhoods with lower household incomes and larger population of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities usually have less access to trees and urban forests than wealthier and less culturally diverse communities. When it comes to climate change adaptation, we all know that green spaces are buffer against many climate impacts, and neighborhoods with low access to green spaces usually are exposed to poorer quality, health consequences of climate change, runoff, flooding, and several climate impacts. Here are a couple of questions that municipal staff or local and regional governments can consider when they are working on projects that enhance equity in green spaces for resilience and adaptation objectives. Do your plans look at intersecting barriers experienced by equity-deserving communities? How can you communicate this information to prioritize support for equity-deserving communities? And if you don't have this information, how might you gather this knowledge, and in collaboration with whom? Who might be effective partners to help support the process? Now I'm just moving to an example for advancing tree equity. We recently attended a workshop by Sustainability Network and Nature Canada. And in this workshop, some examples of these tree equity projects were investigated. One of the projects that were discussed was Tree Equity Campaign project that was developed by Calgary Climate Hub. This project includes a tree equity tool, which is, a tree equity tool, which is actually a spatial tool through which you can observe the distribution of tree canopies in different neighborhoods of Toronto. Using this tool, you can also observe the changes in tree canopies over time in that neighborhoods, and also the tree equity score to understand which neighborhoods lack tree canopy and should be prioritized in tree planting measures. The project also includes a tree planting guide as well. This guide is developed in close collaboration and engagement of communities who lack enough trees in their neighborhoods. And it includes some best practices and some measures that community members can do individually or as a group to just plant trees and increase green spaces in their neighborhood, considering that such measures might not be prioritized by municipalities. The second example that I would like to discuss today relates to affordable and sustainable housing. We all know that in Canada, lack of access of equity-deserving communities to affordable and quality housing can expose them to several risks, such as power outages after extreme weather events, basement flooding, or health consequences of heat waves. Here are a couple of questions that you can consider when you're working on projects that connect affordability, resilience, and equity. Do your plans look at intersecting barriers of housing affordability and resilience? How can affordable, high quality, and climate resilient housing be prioritized as a part of municipal resilience efforts? And who might be effective partners to help support this process? I would like to go through a research I conducted during my PhD studies. This research focuses on Thorncliffe Park, which is a densely populated neighborhood at Toronto. This neighborhood is low income and it has several tower buildings which were built back in 1960s and have actually aging infrastructure and are extremely vulnerable to several hazards. The neighborhood also has also lack enough green spaces and does not have good access to public transit. When I was asking people about climate impacts that they're experiencing, they mentioned that they are experiencing wet interior walls after heavy precipitation, power outages after extreme weather events, sewage backup, and runoff. Despite all of these problems, however, it seemed that they were not concerned about climate change because they had more immediate needs. The results of my survey showed that 85% of participants have prioritized affordable housing as their top priority need, followed by healthcare and employment. And surprisingly, protection against hazards was prioritized the least. Only 30% of participants selected that as their top priority need. I also found that neighborhood residents have not been engaged in urban infrastructure decisions. They didn't have any experience in engaging in housing or infrastructure decisions or green space decisions or even adaptation and resilience. My findings also showed that even if we have an engagement and participatory process, there are many barriers for the neighborhood residents to participate in that decisions. And I specifically found 4 barriers. The first one is lack of social networks. Neighborhood residents mostly were immigrants. They didn't have any tie in Canada. Many of them even didn't attend college or university or didn't have any job. So they didn't have social networks and connections in the Canadian system. The second barrier was lack of citizenship rights. Many residents were refugees, asylum seekers, or even people with no immigration status. So they afraid to get in trouble if they participate in any social activities or any participatory measures, if there were any. And in addition to that, non-citizen residents were not allowed to vote, so they were not able to choose their representatives within the urban government system, and they were not able to impact decisions, so their needs and opinions just remained invisible. The third barrier was climate unawareness. Neighborhood residents actually were not aware of how climate change is impacting their daily life and how they can deal with emergency conditions. And the last barrier was related to communication barriers. Neighborhood residents, many of them had limited skills in English language, so they were not able to communicate their needs. Several people also could not afford internet, so they didn't have access to social media to become aware of social activities or any engagement process if there were any. There were cultural issues within the neighborhood. There were many patriarchal patterns, for example, that just prevent women to participate in social activities. And the last one was related to livelihood barriers. Many residents actually had to work even at the weekends or in the evenings to be able to afford food and housing, so they didn't have any spare time to just participate in optional activities. Okay, this is my last slide. Here, I would like to just introduce an example of a measure or a project that has included the voices of equity-deserving communities in urban revival and resilience. Back in 2012, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority applied its Sustainable Neighborhood Action Plan to the San Romanoway Towers revival project. And these towers are actually located at Jane and Finch neighborhood of Toronto, which is a low-income neighborhood. And the overarching objective of the project was to improve the environmental and social economic conditions of the neighborhood and enhance people's resilience. The project gathered property owners, tenants, nonprofit organizations, City of Toronto, and businesses to just brainstorm the main objectives of the project. So they just started including the voices of equity-deserving communities early in the phases of planning. And the project also applied the participants to leader model, which actively engages community members to foster community leadership. A variety of engagement techniques were used, such as through outdoor events, focus group discussions, and resident tours. And the project ended with some interventions early in the phases of planning to build trust. And the result was 3 interventions or projects: edible gardens, urban agriculture project and training, and building retrofits. Through the edible balconies, people were provided with supports and resources to just grow their own food in their balconies. For the urban agriculture project, people were provided with several spaces in the neighborhood to grow their own trees. And in addition to that, they were provided with several training sessions to be able to care trees. And also, these training sessions were helpful for them to develop their career skills and use them in their future jobs, actually find jobs or just have some progress in their careers. And the last one was building retrofits. People were provided with some resources to have access to different programs at City of Toronto to upgrade the water fixtures and energy fixtures in their own buildings and to save energy and water use. There were also some Green Champion programs. Actually, these programs were educational. So they were just training people how to change their behaviors to conserve water and save energy. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. And we are looking forward to your questions.
Thank you both. That was wonderful. So great to hear your thoughts. There's some feedback in the chat to say it's useful, and lots of room to include the learnings from your presentations in the implementation measures that we would like to move forward with in the collaborative, in the regional collaborative. We have a lovely small group, so feel free to just unmute and share your questions. And yeah, no worries if you need to jump off. We do have a quick survey that maybe we'll launch. Michelle, if you are able to stay and respond to that survey before you go, that's great. And if not, no worries. Maybe she hopped off already, so that's okay. Yeah, so we'll just have the survey in the background there, and I'll put it in the chat as well. But let's just do the survey if you can before you leave. Otherwise, really open to questions and conversation here, to listen to examples of when you have included an equity lens in your planning processes, or if you want to pick the brains of Naomi and Niloofar for ideas. Maybe I'll just kind of seed with one question here. There was a few resources that were shared both from within ICLEI as well as kind of the project examples that were shared. I'm wondering about tools and policies and frameworks that have been helpful for supporting climate change adaptation, or in general equitable considerations in local government planning. If anybody has used any or come across any that hasn't been shared, we will be, alongside the recording and the resources that we have knowledge of, sharing some all of these back with the bigger group who weren't able to be here today. So if you have any resources that you want to speak to or that you've heard about that would be relevant to this, please feel free to chime in with it.
Maybe I'll jump. I'm just gonna, it's actually slightly different direction. An example I'd wanted to share in the presentation, but then was sort of, how much time it had been. But just sort of an example of actually moving away from just sort of the planning piece to sort of implementation when it comes to equitable frameworks. So Dufferin County, which is county in Ontario, has been in the process of developing a resilience hub for their community. That's aimed at both educating folks, but also creating a space for them to come together and learn about climate and climate change impacts, various aspects. And they've taken an interesting model to how they've approached the design and implementation and building of the project. They've actually done the work through having 2 sort of decision-making tables in the process of both planning and implementation, but they have a community decision-making table, sort of leadership table, and then they have one that's can't remember quite what it's called, but it's sort of the policy side of the conversation. But the decision-making group for what happens with that resilience hub is it's entirely led by that community action table, and that table is made up of a number of different local organizations representing different equity, deserving, and denied groups, youth, different ages, access, like a number of different pieces that come to that conversation. And then the policy table is really, it's a number of professionals sort of across different fields who, so it includes folks who work in municipal policy, folks who work at different branches of work. I do know that there's, for example, a police officer who sits on the board, and one of the things they noted about making this decision was that there were a number of people who were in the community table, like it's sort of recognizing that that might not be a safe space for a lot of the people in and on the community table. And what this other policy sort of professionals table does is they really just sort of consult on the decisions that are made by the community action table to sort of say, this is doable. These are some of the constraints you might face. Here are some of the so sort of to provide some of the framework that I think it's a really great example of bringing together two different types of expertise and recognizing them both as expertise. Yeah. And so it's a really worthwhile project. And I know in another one of these workshops I did, Sarah from Deference spoke a bit about it. So it might be worth, sort of checking out what she had to say about it. One of the things noting that, to get the community action table out, they prioritized, again, sort of recognizing, arranging around timing that would work for the folks coming. It was outside of their work hours, but they did pay the folks on the community action table to be there, and they also provided childcare. So those were three really key ways of getting them to, be able to show up and do that work. So I just like to show or share that example because it was very sort of interesting and impactful to hear about how they've been going about that. And of course, all the work is quite ongoing, but I think interesting to see. Again, while it is still a lot of planning, it's moving beyond just the adaptation planning stage into really thinking about what implementation looks like and what community-led decision-making looks like. Thinking about how, the municipality there, the regional government can support or do the work that they're planning to do, but in a way that is guided by community input. So to share that.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And it always gets to the nitty-gritty of when they are figuring out the childcare and the paying of the community members, who's going to invoice it and how do you process it through your administrative processes. And it's really good to know about real examples of this happening, because it's one thing to ideate it, but to know the actual project. So great that you have that connection, and maybe we can link to them as applicable for this project if that's the type of measure we move forward.
Yeah, I would like to mention another example in addition to what Naomi measures. There are many championship programs, climate championship programs, for example, at City of Toronto. And through these championship programs, the municipal staff just select some representatives from the community who knows about the needs of the community and who have networks in the community, and they speak in their native language, can go through them and ask them about their needs. And I think that this tool is also very effective, specifically for including the voices of those who cannot communicate in English perfectly. And there are also educational programs for those champions as well, to just become aware of climate change, to just can train people how to save energy, how to protect themselves against climate impacts, things like that. I found that also very helpful in addressing the barriers for engagement.
That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that. And the region of the collaborative has a lot of immigrants of different parts of the world, and so that language barrier is a real one. I love the idea of training those champions to then kind of having people within the community who hold that knowledge.
I think there is a question from Chris.
Go for it, Chris.
Hi, yeah, I have a question. Thank you for the presentation, first of all. Very insightful stuff. You mentioned the idea of political readiness as a potential barrier and something to overcome. And I'm just wondering, given the shift in the political sort of environment toward, a lot of cuts and fiscal savings, from my understanding, equity investments could have a greater upfront costs, much like climate change generally. So I'm just wondering if there's any studies or anything similar that sort of show the long-term benefits of such an investment, perhaps with a dollar amount. I know this is like sort of new in the climate field, but a lot of new research is helping sort of put that dollar amount in front of, elected leadership to say, hey, this is very much worthwhile, not in terms of just the human element, but also the dollar amount as well for investments. Thank you.
Yeah, for the engagement, I unfortunately don't know any studies, but for adaptation itself, we have a cost of doing nothing component at ICLEI Canada. I'm not expert in that. Maybe Naomi knows more about that. But in cost of doing nothing, actually it is an initiative in which we calculate the cost of climate impact if we do no actions, if we do nothing. And I'm not sure, Naomi or Ainaz, do you know that it includes dollar amount for that, or?
I would say that I wouldn't say that it has necessarily a super like fleshed out equity component. Like there are certain elements to it that maybe don't like that move away from the idea of just infrastructure, say being the point of that. Like I know that there's sort of an emphasis on, for example, health. They're thinking about that. And I think there's an interesting way into that. I think that goes back to kind of the making the case piece about identifying where those sort of shared priorities are. So yeah, and I'm happy to get back to you on that. And I don't, again, off the top of my head, have any sort of studies that give a dollar amount, but I'd be certainly happy to sort of check back in and sort of go through some of the resources I have to get back to you on that.
I want to add one piece in is that it might not be directly the study that shows the dollar amount of equitable investment reducing impact on those populations for climate resilience. But there are studies out there already, and I'll find a few links and send your way, Chris, that Canadian Climate Institute has put out, or different research groups have put out on the impact of climate change on equity deserving or priority populations that are marginalized. And I think that would be the kind of way to link it to. And there are studies that show, I've heard range from like 4-to-1 investment on resilience or 15-to-1 investment on resilience, being that if you invest upfront, then you avoid paying it in disaster relief funds or insurance fees afterwards. That could be the way to kind of back calculate or to speak to this concept that, it's equity deserving groups that are being highly impacted. And so that's where we should prioritize implementing resilience to reduce the cost overall in the long term.
Yeah, thank you. I think those resources would be really helpful, especially as staff, just to sort of present the facts to elected leadership to really help push that direction. So thank you.
Thank you for the question. And then maybe I'll just touch on the cost of doing nothing. Thank you, Niloofar, for bringing that forward. There is intention for the two projects to kind of do some co-training together. So I think by the fall, we will have some additional resources and kind of some formalized training, perhaps, that we can collaborate with the cost of doing nothing project of ICLEI. Well, this is great. I feel like we are coming to a natural close. We can close the survey poll as well, perhaps, if it seems like a few responses did come through. Thank you, everybody, for your time and sharing space with us today on exploring equitable adaptation, and looking forward to connect with you again next week at the next presentation, or at meetings as they come up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And nice to meet you, Chris.
Nice to meet you both too. Yeah, all of you. Okay, take care.
We'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Stop the recording.
Oh. Should I stop recording?
Is there anything else? So I can
Yeah, no.